Charlotte Eichels, the Director of the Asian Studies Program, and I want to welcome you to the second in a series of three lectures this semester on India, the migration of religion, people, and ideas. The series is sponsored by the Asian Studies Program with funding from the Mitzi Levine Byrne and Daniel Byrne Endowment for Asian Studies. Today's speaker is Professor Devesh Kapur, who received his PhD in public policy from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. He is currently the Madan Sobti Associate Professor for the Study of India and the Director of the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to joining the University of Pennsylvania, he held appointments at the Brookings Institution, Harvard University, and the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Kapur is the author of several books, I'm just going to mention a few, including one on the World Bank, one on the global hunt for talent, and one on public institutions in India. He is currently working on 4 major projects. Again, I'll only mention 2 in this case. One is examining the impact of economic liberalization on India's socially marginal groups. Another, supported by a huge grant from the Indian government, is looking at international migration from India and the impact of Indian-American entrepreneurship on India. Today, he will be talking on a closely related topic, the political impact of international migration from India. This is also the topic of his most recent book, Diaspora, Democracy and Development, the Impact of International Migration from India on India, published by Princeton University Press just last year, 2010. So I present Professor Kapur.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Alec, for being here. This talk draws on work I've been doing actually for the past 5-6 years, and is also sort of based on my book. When I began this project, by and large, in the past 15 to 20 years, there's been a fair bit of work on sort of globalization and its impact in very different forms. So most of that has, by and large, focused on the impact of like financial flows, whether it's FDI or portfolio flows or debt flows, the impact of international trade. And in the past decade in particular, there started to be more and more work on international migration. Most of this work on migration has focused on the impact on receiving countries, right? So the impact of migration from North Africa, to Europe, the impact of migration from Central America and from Mexico, to the US, and so on. My work is the mirror image. What's the impact on the sending country? Now, what I'll do is to present my talk in sort of 3 parts. The first part is actually trying to give you a framework of how one should think through what are the links and what are the mechanisms through which international migration can affect the country of origin. The second part, which is based on original data which I had gathered on very large-scale surveys, looks at who leaves India. And the third part then looks at the impact also on India. So here's a way to think about how migration can affect a country, right? One is what might call the prospect channel, right? The fact that how does an individual's behavior change if she or he thinks they might leave the country, right? So we find that that the growth of sort of nursing schools, sort of in India, the growth of private schools, and also who began to go for nursing, began to change very rapidly after the US opened up its market for international nurses, right? So people's behavior about what type of education I might get can be shaped by if they think that with that education they can go to someplace. The second channel is what one calls the absence. The absence is when people who were going to be in a country are no longer there, right? So if you look at the fact, when we look at countries with very large
migration,
like sort of Haiti, right? You find that a significant part of that population from Haiti is actually outside it. And so you ask the counterfactual, how would Haiti have been different if these people had not been able to leave, right? The third, I'm sorry, I didn't write this well, but the third is the diaspora channel, right? Which is how we think about migrants who now stay elsewhere, and the impact or the role they have like from far, right? So the central idea is that an immigrant, she or he, retains certain types of links with the country of origin, and so is not just sort of another foreigner just because that person is not like resident sort of at home. And of course, the last one is the return channel, right? People go, they earn an income, they have some financial savings, and then they go back, right? But they also expose to new ideas, new ways of thinking, and they take these back with them, right? So if you think of the absence channel, right, the sort of classic way of thinking is sort of the sort of framework of Albert Hirschman, which is about exit and voice, right? So if you exit, you lose voice, right? Because you're not there. And we actually see that is not the case sort of anymore, right? Diasporas have basically exited, but they have and can have large impacts on the country of origin, right? It can be the sort of Armenians sort of having an impact on Armenia, which is very significant. It's of course been true sort of the Jewish diaspora, which is not resident, within Israel. So there's a range of ways in which people who have left it actually, because they are either have more wealth or are in countries that are politically powerful, it can actually amplify their voice rather than the other way around. The absence channel can also have big impacts on the political stability of a regime, right? So if you think about Cuba, right, it's a great example where you've had successive waves of migrants. And the Cuban government has actually used this as a safety valve to get rid of sort of disgruntled voices, right? And you could argue that the regime has been more stable because of that. But you have the opposite also, right? And the collapse of the Berlin Wall is a good example, right? It's when you had massive exit from East Germany, and it's not surprising that totalitarian governments in particular never want to open up their borders, right? And because it's not that they fear people will come in, but they fear that everyone will leave. And North Korea is a great example, right? If people were allowed to leave North Korea, that regime is very likely to sort of collapse. The absence channel in this literature has generally, we think of it, one word has been sort of brain drain, right? That's the way people think of the absence channel, right? And this is that what it sort of alerts one is to the fact that, especially from developing countries, is there a particular selection bias in who leaves, right? And the selection bias is either that, look, your best and brightest are leaving, and that's the sort of brain drain, right? So from Africa, these sort of nurses and doctors leave, and so Africa has this big medical crisis like HIV, and you don't have the medical personnel. That's the way we think about brain drain. And this phrase actually began to be used a lot from the late 1960s. What is interesting, as I'll show you, that in the past 15 years, you see a sort of different type of phrase. Instead of brain drain, you see the words brain bank, brain trust. So the idea that actually these brains, while they have left, still actually can be a sort of resource to the country of origin. And my argument is that we have to be very careful when we look at international, the sort of effects of international migration in who leaves, right? Is it the young? Is it the old? Is it the educated? Is it the less educated? Is it, for instance, we see from Iraq, is it the Christians who are leaving in, disproportionately? And what is its long-term impact on a secular society, right? So it can be by like gender, like from Philippines, it's much more like women, and it has had a major impact on Philippine society. So the selection effects, and there are always selection effects on sort of who leaves, which has huge impacts. And these, we can think of it, right, of the short-term impacts, but also the very long-term impacts. There's some very nice work now looking at the very long-term effects, sort of impacts on institutions sort of in Africa because of the slave trade, right? And of course, the slave trade was migration, except it's forced migration, right? And you find that these arguments show very carefully that the nature of Africa's institutions is very much linked to the fact on who left and how many left from particular parts of sort of Africa. So absent sort of effects can have short-term effects, but also you could argue can have very profound long-term implications. So this is the sort of diaspora channel, right, which is the third one, which is the fact that diasporas can be a source of like money, of ideas, of technologies, of expectations. It's not surprising if you look at the leadership of most countries that were that became independent. Almost all their leadership had studied abroad. It's a very strong selection effect, right? If you look at India's freedom movement, all the key leadership from Gandhi and Nehru, from Ambedkar to Patel, it's not only that they had all studied abroad, they had a particular type of education, which was an education in law in England, right? And one of the arguments which I make in my book is that shaped their belief in the value of processes, which is of course what law is about, right? It's about procedure, not just outcomes. And of course, the democracy is also sort of about procedural fealty, right? It's not just about outcomes. There is now work which sort of looks at the impact of like migration when people, what one calls social remittances, right? So there's a very nice work which looks at the Middle East. And why has the fertility rate gone down much more in sort of Morocco compared to Egypt? And what this work sort of shows is that migrants from Morocco went to France, and from Egypt largely went to Saudi Arabia, and they imbibed the family size of the countries where they went to, and they transmitted these ideas back, so that Morocco, the ideal family size became much smaller because of the influence of migrants based in France. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, the family size is sort of much larger, and that was the transmission of ideas back, right? So the effects will, of course, depend on the characteristics of the host country, right? It will matter a lot where you go. And I think the diaspora channel's influence has become greater now, because now dual citizenship has increased very rapidly in the past 15 years, and so has made the countries of origin more receptive, right? So in the past, you felt that, okay, if you've left and have gone to country X, you've become a citizen of country X, and it was a zero-sum game. Either you are our citizen or you are a citizen of that country. But now you find that is no longer the case. So there's this sort of gray area has made it more acceptable to link up with diasporas. The most sort of, however, emphasis on the role of diaspora has been on the role of financial remittances. So financial remittances now to developing countries are in the order of about $350 billion. Now, when there's that much like money, it's not surprising it will have some effects, right? And the question is what types of effects. So one is, so think of a poor country like Nepal or like Haiti, right? Now, poor countries get foreign aid. Poor countries also have many of the citizens working outside, families who've left, and they send back like money like to their own families. And here what you find is two very different effects. In the case where you get foreign aid, right, foreign aid comes to the government of a country. So it strengthens the state. Whereas remittances go, of course, to households and to families. So what it does, the more you get remittances, the more it shifts the relationship between state and society towards these of latter, right? Because people no longer need the state as much because they have their own forms of insurance, they have their own ways of getting funds. They're not as dependent on the state. So what we find is, for instance, studies in sort of Mexico show that this patron-client relationships in local politics have been weakened by like remittances. I don't have to go to my local politician and beg him for A, B, and C because I can get like money like from my brother who is sending it, right? The case of El Salvador, we find that old elites in El Salvador who were very much based on land, and hence you had these massive civil wars there and so on. Once many El Salvadorans left and they began sending back like money, the old elites shifted their economic base from land to banking and other sources of like money, which were based on the remittance economy. So they didn't care as much about holding on like to land. So they became more amenable to changes and to more pro the democratic changes by the end of the late 1980s. But we have the opposite sort of effect in a country like Philippines, right? And you could argue now in Central America. And the Philippines is a great example of a country that actually based its whole economy on migration and remittances, right? Starting sort of with the Marcos years. And you can see that the whole higher education system of Philippines is really geared to sort of international migration, and people in Philippines who even study like people who are trained as like doctors, then apply for an international exam like to become a nurse, because it's much easier to migrate as a nurse than to migrate sort of as a doctor. So you have these very complex effects that are happening in countries where you have very large scale migration. The one thing which we also see is that because migration is very selective, it's not just by individuals' characteristics, but also by like social groups. So it might be that in a country, particular groups, whether it's ethnic groups or from particular parts of the country, we find that we have strong selection bias in particular social groups, which means, of course, that over time you can have very serious impact on income distribution across groups, which can both be a sort of good thing, but can also be a source of like conflict. Now, one more like troubling aspect of the diaspora channel, which we see, is there's now fairly strong evidence that since the end of the Cold War, diasporas have emerged as singularly important actors in support who are involved in international conflict. Whether it is civil sort of insurgencies, the terrorism, sort of militant movements. This is, of course, like not new. It's just that the scale of it is much larger. So, if you go back to the Boston sort of iteration, the support like for the IRA, it goes back like many like decades. And this has been around like for, you could argue for most of the 20th century. But there is reason like to believe that either both because migration itself has grown, and it's a sort of very circular thing, because if you have conflict, people leave, and the people who leave, like many of them are disgruntled and support the conflict of particular groups that were part of the conflict to sort of begin with. In sort of recent years, like Sri Lanka is a very good example, right, where the Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora played an important role in that conflict. What we are not sure is, or what we see is, of course, that diasporas are playing a role when you have an emergency, right? Their involvement in the country of origin takes the form of both ethnic nationalism but also civic, right? So you see a lot of flow of philanthropic like money when you have an earthquake or a major natural disaster. But you also see a lot of like money flowing to like support particular groups when you have this ethnic like nationalism. And this is the final sort of channel, right? This is when people come back with new skills and ideas. These skills and ideas are usually positive, but not always, right? There's an interesting study which shows the growth of like violence in sort of places like Honduras and El Salvador now, and it's been traced like to the fact that the US has been deporting people from US jails from those countries. And unlike the past, gangs in Honduras and El Salvador, their use of, or their gang warfare was more based on knives and so on and so forth. But here, they've picked up much better skills. And so they use guns much more here. So they take those skills back with them. And so the new forms of gang warfare use are far more bloody because they use guns like much more. So it's a skill. I put that in quotes, depending on how broad-minded you are regarding skills. So just as I sort of discussed, the selection effects on who returns also matters, right? So is it the fact that the best and brightest stay behind, and those who didn't sort of make it, is it those guys who sort of return? Or is it people who are more driven by a sense of sort of nationalist pride who sort of go back, right? So it's very hard actually ex ante like to know, because it's what we call the difference between observables. You can observe a person's sort of education level and so on. But the unobservable characteristics, is it people who are more honest who go back? Is it people with more integrity who go back, or the opposite, right? These are sort of unobservable characteristics, but they could play a much greater sort of role, right? So to sort of end this part, what we find is that the magnitude of this impact, right, it will depend on who leaves. That's by whether you look at it by age, gender, education, religion, who returns. Again, it's the selection and impact. Very importantly, why do people leave? People leave like for a reason, right? The impacts are going to be very different if people leave for better economic opportunities, or they leave because they're victims of ethnic cleansing, right? They're much less likely to have a positive impact on the country of origin if they leave because they're really angry, than if they're just leaving for better economic opportunities, right? It matters like where you go, right? When Indians go to Saudi Arabia and when Indians go to sort of the sort of UK or the sort of US, the likelihood is that the impact is going to be different. how long have you been gone for, right? Because your links might actually decay over time, or actually we actually find it's the opposite, because for the first decade when you leave, you're trying to make your life so you're not too engaged in the country of origin. Then after that, you finally got your personal life has sort of stabilized. Now you begin to actually have links with your country of origin because you can afford to, in a sense. But over time, gradually your social networks, etc., shift, so you get a sort of U-shaped curve. And the last is sort of vintage, about those who left, in the 1960s, like from India, versus those who left in the 90s. The effects on India are going to be very different because India itself has changed a lot, right? So the people who left India in the 60s and 70s thought India was a place that would never grow, was really not the happening place, etc. So they sort of had almost given up. Whereas now it's a different story, right? And so the way you think about the country of origin will also be very different. Okay, so here's the thing about who leaves India. Now this data which I'm going to present is based on several surveys, but one of the surveys was a survey of 220,000 households. It's the largest ever survey done on international migration from India. And so what this data does is to give you a sense as to this critical variable on the selection characteristics of who leaves India. So just to give you a long sort of history of migration from India. So by and large, migration from India begins around the mid 19th century, and it begins when the slave trade comes to an end, right? That's when there is need for indentured labor, especially in the sugar plantations in sort of Trinidad to like Fiji, a whole host of the countries. And that's when the Indians who leave are primarily leave as indentured labor. They are largely, of course, very unskilled, and they're from the lower castes. Indentured labor comes to an end around 1870s or a bit earlier, and then you find the next migration stream is sort of petty traders, clerks, bureaucrats, professionals. If you look at the Hong Kong police in the late 19th century, it's all Sikhs, right? And it's of course part of the migration is because of the nature of the British sort of empire, right? And it's through the empire that you have, wherever the empire is, because of the nature of British influence, within India, it's the lower bureaucrats and functionaries of the empire who are from the Indian subcontinent, right? And they especially go to East Africa, South Africa. Post-independence, you again have a big sort of increase in unskilled and semi-skilled labor, which is largely in the 1950s and early 60s. This is when Europe has major labor shortages. So each of the colonial powers is getting labor from the countries to which it has these sort of closest links, right? France gets from sort of North Africa, and England, of course, gets from the subcontinent. This is largely concentrated in two states, Punjab and sort of Gujarat, and it ends by the early 60s. After that, you have two very large streams, which basically one begins in 65, and that's the one to the US. Prior, if you look at the US census, 1960 is about less than 10,000 are from India. And by this census, it will be closer to about 3 million, right? So there's been a huge sort of increase. And what I'll show you is, if I have that time, is that Indian migration, like to the US, has been about the most selective migration in the 20th century, which is the human capital of the migrants who are leaving India. The gap between them and those who stay in India is the largest from any sending country. So the migration to the US is particularly selective in the human capital of those who leave. And that's one reason why this group has done well here, because the starting point is very high. And the third stream, of course, is this very, very large migrant stream that has gone to the Gulf, right? Saudi Arabia itself has more than 1 million Indians. And if you go to, I was just in UAE, and you see a whole host of the sort of everyone from sort of labor to mid-level managers are from the subcontinent and from India. So here's the thing based on the survey. And what I'll show you, it's a little this thing, so I'll sort of explain it to you. So SEC is a socioeconomic classification, right? And what it is basically a way to think about it is that SEC-A is those who have a graduate degree and are what we call by occupation are executives or managers. So they are upper level professionals, right? Now, so one of the things you can very easily see the sort of bias, right? So this group is barely 2.8% of the population within India, right? But 35% of all Indians in the United States are from this group, right? Whereas, so A through E is urban India, R1 to R4 is rural India, right? If you look at this group, this is the bottom, right? This is the rural poor, basically. It's 1/3 of India's population, and almost no one from that group comes here, right? And if you take, ratios, it's more than of magnitude, right? So this alone tells you sort of who comes, right? Whereas if you look at Middle East, right, you see R3, which is the second, sort of basically unskilled but not the poorest group, and that's where you see a very large number who are coming, who are going to the Middle East, right? And so what is not surprising, right, is that OECD countries, rich countries, attract the people with the largest human capital, and countries in the Middle East, etc., attract more sort of unskilled and semi-skilled, labor, right? If you look at it in a different way, this is from a different source, and it's one way to think about it. If you look at 2000, right? So the emigration rate of people with primary education is 0.1%, and with tertiary education is 4.2%. It's a ratio of 42 times, right? And that's the selection effect, right? Far more leave with tertiary education than those with primary education. But of course, a country like India, there are far more people with only primary education than those with tertiary education. So in that sense, India does lose a scarce endowment, which is its human capital. I'll skip this. Okay, this is when you look at it by sort of religion, right? Now you can see that like Muslims go they are the majority, right? That's where they go to the Middle East. Whereas if you look at Hindus, they'll come much more like to the US, right? So now you can begin to think of what are the sorts of things that might happen, right, when you get different groups going to different countries. Is it the case, for instance, that Muslims, when they go to the Middle East and they come back, is it the case that how is their faith, in a sense, affected by that experience, right? If you look at it by caste, right? The migration, like the US, if you look at the Indian American, this is based on a different survey which I did. Actually, it's not based on a survey. I created a database of virtually every Indian American household at the time. That was 500,000 households. Now, you can see how this is barely less than a fifth of India's population, but most of it is drawn in the US is drawn from the upper caste. The dominant castes are a category that are castes that are sort of middle castes, but which are dominant in rural India because they own land and are numerically large. And the basis of rural power is, of course, ownership of land, right? That's the other group. That's very dominant because they parlayed the rural, success. And a very good example is groups like Patels, like from Gujarat. And I'm sure at some point, if you've ever been to a like motel, if you use like motels, 1/3 of all motel rooms sort of in the United States are owned by members of this group. Now, whereas just look at low caste, right? Negligible. And the low castes are at least it's barely it's less than 1%, and it's at least 1/4 to between a fifth and 1/4 of India's population. So it's a very upper caste like dom. And towards the end, I'll give you a more provocative argument of what might have been the impact of this selection. So now, if we look at Indian households with global networks, right? Now this is, I don't know if you, last few months from The Economist to The Atlantic have had some issues on the global elite. One of the things about global elites is they have global networks, right? So this is this SECA group, right? The urban elite. Basically more than 1 out of 3 households in that, or this A1 is the top 1% of India's population, right? And more than 1 out of 3 households have someone sort of outside. And the more selective you get, for instance, I quietly did a survey of all of India's retired 4-star generals. 1 out of 2 have a son or daughter here, sort of now like living here. So the more elite you get, the more likely you have a kid who's abroad, and the more likely, if the kid is abroad, he or she will be sort of in the US. Whereas if you go to the bottom, right, which is the R4, which is the bottom 1/3 of India's population, virtually no global networks, right? And global networks for households make a big difference in your access to ideas, jobs, education, business. It's a whole, there's an sort of advantage which you get, which is very, very large because of your access to these networks. Okay, so now to the last part. This is so what? Okay, so here's very, very simple, right? So India is the largest recipient of financial remittances now. Vastly exceeds everything it gets from FDI to portfolio flows. It's now almost 5% of GDP, and it is also the most stable flow. So it's not only it's large, it's also very stable, because global financial flows can be very unstable, meaning they're very volatile. This source of flow is very stable. Migration has had a much greater impact in skill-intensive industries, and there's now good work from a variety of sources how important a role it's played in the development of India's IT sector, because IT is a services-oriented sector. It's a tradable sector. So you can imagine, first of all, that migration has a much greater impact on sort of tradable sectors than on non-tradable, right? The one exception is the diamond cutting industry, which is the one blue-collar industry which has been shaped immensely by international migration. In particular, 80% of the world's diamonds are cut and polished within India, and from virtually a very small fraction in the 1960s. And there's a very interesting story of how basically one small group of what are called Palanpuri Jains from a part of Gujarat, how they took over and displaced these Hasidic Jews from Antwerp in the control of the global diamond trade. And it's that trade, once you begin to control the trade of rough diamonds, that's where you begin to source them back for polishing. And there's a new word like for this, which is the opposite of outsourcing. It's called insourcing. So you source. So it used to be that from Antwerp in the 50s, a lot of the cutting and polishing was sent to Tel Aviv and sort of Haifa. But as Israeli sort of wage rates rose, the very tiny diamonds, they were just not worth their while. Because it's very labor intensive. So what happened in Israel shifted to very high-end diamonds, and all the low-end stuff began to move towards India. And then this sector basically grew in very big. Okay, so then. On human capital and innovation, I think it has had a very mixed effect. In particular, which I want to show you here, I think it's had a very negative impact on India's higher education system, which has not been able to replicate itself in the way it had managed to do in the 50s and 60s, because the sorts of people who would have been the faculty and therefore led to the growth of these institutions, they basically left. So there I think the impact has definitely been more negative. What you see is, if you look at in this part of Indian science, that until the 1950s, most of those who left, and they've left to study largely in the UK, but also in sort of Germany, they all came back, and they came back to join public institutions. This is when India was establishing its major labs and IITs and so on and so forth. After the mid-1960s, both the locus of migration changed for higher education from the UK to the US, and fewer began to come back. And that status, I'm talking of now those who have PhDs in physics or molecular biology, and so that's a much smaller group of people. And that was the state of affairs till the late 1990s. Since then, the rate of return has again begun to go up, not in huge numbers, but has. But the re-entry point is not the public sector, it's the private sector. It's now the re-entry point is GE labs or Microsoft labs or Google India. It's not the public university system, which is still incredibly starved of talent. So as India is expanding rapidly higher education, you find that its best universities have faculty shortages of 30-40%. So this is a figure which just gives you a very quick thing of NRI, of sort of remittances, and you can see that for periods of time, right, about 1/4 of all India's sort of imports were basically being financed by remittances. These are NRI deposits, which is banking deposits, and about almost 1/3 of India's external debt is actually to its own citizens, but living sort of abroad, and who basically have bank accounts within India. They're called NRE accounts, and that is a very large sum of money. There's a nice comparison if you look at financial flows to China and India, right? Just those years from 2000 to 2007. If you look at portfolio flows, right? They are somewhat comparable. If you look at FDI, China is way more than India, right? If you look at like remittances, right, India is more than China, and this has actually, gap has increased. So if you look at total financial flows, actually as a share of like GDP externally, because China's like GDP is about like 3 times India's, actually India gets more from outside than like China, largely because of the very large fraction of money that comes from financial remittances. Now, when we did this survey of Indian Americans, of the nature of their links, you can see that while say about 1 out of 6 have some type of economic links with India, whether it's, and this number has actually grown since then. It's about job opportunities. Now, what's interesting is, although we don't have firm data, this ratio about job opportunities in the US and job opportunities in India, this ratio has sort of reversed. And it has like reversed for obvious like reasons, because of the economic downturn here and economic growth within India, right? Fewer people are looking for jobs here because they know it's going to be much harder, but more people from here are looking for jobs in India because of the rapid growth there. If you look at sort of investment, you'll see that the majority of investment is so-called passive investment, which is bank accounts or real estate, right? This, rather than starting like new firms, right, as FDI. So, of course, once you invest in bank accounts, the banks then themselves will on-lend to other companies. So, while a large like number do invest, but it's not in an investment that is, directly growth. Okay, so here's some ways of thinking about the sort of political impact. One, it's very clear that in the US at least, because of the particularly diffuse like nature and porous like nature of American institutions, that they have emerged as a strong foreign policy group, lobbying group. And they clearly lobbied very hard for the India-US nuclear deal, and also behind the India-US strategic relationship. The model to some extent is sort of APAC. I'm sorry. The American like Jewish groups are their models, and in fact they get almost like coaching from the American like Jewish groups, which see India as an ally for sort of Israel. But the Indian diaspora has also been what I have called a soft sort of underbelly. Over the past like 25 years, a range of sort of violence or extremism in India has had links, and that's where there's a lot of controversy on the intensity of the links, but undoubtedly there have been links. And this has ranged from support like from the diaspora for Hindu extremist groups, for support from overseas Indian Kashmiris for what's happening in Kashmir, extremist groups in the northeast who've settled in Thailand and Bangladesh, the Sikh extremism of the 1980s, where Sikh groups from UK and in particular were strongly involved. And now we see some, although it's still very small, of some Indian Muslims after the 2002 like anti-Muslim like riots in Gujarat, with links who had gone to start to work sort of in the Middle East and were recruited there, have had some links with violence within India. So it's a whole range where you see that the diaspora is playing or has and is playing a role. I think what you find is that, and I will sort of show you this towards the end, is that the degree to which the diaspora plays this role really fundamentally depends on what happens within the country. So it's more like fishing in troubled like waters. It's not that they begin the trouble. It's that India or something happened in India which was incredibly stupid, which really gave made a number of people very angry who were outside, and they channeled that anger to further support that cause. It's not that they started that. It's just that something happened and they added fuel to the fire. What you see is now that unlike the past, and it's that where India really kept its diaspora at a distance. There was the term NRI, which stands for non-resident Indian, used to be seen as not really Indian. And you see a shift there. And now India has introduced the so-called OCI, which is Overseas Citizen of India, and PIO, People of Indian Origin cards. NRIs from this next election, beginning actually in the next few months, will be allowed to vote. It'll still be, in a practical sense, it'll be very difficult. I mean, it's more symbolic. But nonetheless, you can see that these symbolic moves are largely to try and attract and create stronger links with the diaspora. So it's an interesting thing you could ask, that is India changing, in a sort of de facto sense, the very basis of its way it has thought of sort of citizenship, from a more jus soli, which is the territorial base, like the sort of US, to a more jus sanguini, which is sort of like Germany, which is more sort of ethnicity based. The final point which I'll make is has migration from India actually reduced conflict within India? In particular, has it been an important factor in why India's democracy has been fundamentally stable? Now this, I'll just spend a few minutes because it's a bit of an argument which I have to develop. So here, one of the biggest puzzles in sort of political science and democratic political theory is, why did India remain democratic? It had everything, all its characteristics were fundamentally against India being a democratic country. If you look at the entire literature going back to Locke, it was a very heterogeneous society, didn't have a single national language, very poor, mainly rural. India's first elections, right, in 1952, 85% of the population was illiterate. There was no middle class virtually at the time, right? No bourgeoisie. So all of these things which people have argued over time are the sort of sine qua non for a country to remain democratic were all missing within India, right? And yet, whenever you read any book on democratic stability, democratic breakdown, all of that, on whatever page, 300 towards the end, they'll say, but there's an exception, and that's India. And sort of, we throw up the hands, we come up with something. So one thing is, if you ask countries like Latin America, right, or even now, some of you have followed Thailand, where you see this breakdown, right? Almost all the work which looks at why in democracies you see a breakdown, right? Almost always it comes down to one fundamental factor, which is intra-elite conflict. And what's the source of this, right? So fundamentally, right, when a country becomes democratic, there's usually a very tiny elite. And of course, what universal franchise does, you have the iron power of numbers, right? Lots of people now have a say in who becomes the new political elite. And it's not going to be the guys who were there around if you allow the iron law of numbers to work. And so what you find is, in many or most cases of democratic breakdown, right, when you suddenly give universal franchise, right, The people now vote and select a political leadership, which is very different in its social basis and its economic basis from those who were sort of at the top so earlier. And so that means the old elite will get displaced. And when the old elite gets displaced, it fights back. And when it fights back, you have conflict. And usually in Latin America and so on, the old elite was very linked with the military, right? And often with the church, and that depends on which part of the world which you're looking at, right? Now, this didn't happen in India. And the reason I argue is that in Indian elite's case, international migration, it provided an escape valve. It provided an escape valve where the old elite could continue to maintain its economic privileges. So they were not that prepared to fight, because you fight to try and retain your economic and financial privilege. But if you can have that in any case, why bother, right? So in sort of, usually when we think of sort of breakdown, right? You have an old elite right at the top, everyone wants to be there. Now when you have universal franchise, these new groups begin to rise up, right? But when they rise up, not everyone can be here. That's when you get conflict, right? In India's case, right, and the old elite was largely upper caste, and as I showed you, most of the old elite, the upper caste, not most of them have left, but enough have left to be able to provide this safety valve. And the process actually begins virtually 2-3 years after independence. And someone's phone is ringing. Okay. So what you have is that the southern state of Tamil Nadu is where you see this conflict first beginning. And there, the tiny elite is Tamil Brahmins, which is about 5%. And they really, really dominate that state. And, with universal, franchise, they're basically ousted. And within a few years, Tamil Brahmins, who were by far the most educated people in that state, almost can't get admitted to college anymore, right? Because the new guys come in and say, we have affirmative action, and guess what? The affirmative action is such that a Tamil Brahmin, the guys who were 99% earlier, now get 1% of the share. So of course, that is a classic, recipe for conflict, right? You're really challenging the very basis of dominance of the old elite. In this case, was higher education. Now, the difference also was India's elites, interestingly enough, unlike the ones in Latin America, or say Philippines or Pakistan, their capital was in mobile human capital, much less in land. Land, of course, you can't live with it. So yes, you had a landed elite, but a landed elite in an Indian, rural India in 1960 would have 200 acres of land. That would be a large landlord. A landed elite in Argentina would have 20,000 acres of land. It's a completely different ballgame, right? So landed elites in India were basically local elites. They were never national elites. The basis, national elites, when you think of the freedom struggle, right, you'll think of Nehru or Gandhi and all, right? What is it that is really distinctive is the human capital, right? In a country where you barely had 5% literate in 1930, these guys had, law degrees from England, from the best places. It was a tiny, tiny elite. And interestingly enough, they wrote a constitution which virtually for sure was the death knell of their own class. Because the constitution, India was the first country which created universal franchise all at once, right? When you look at Europe or the US, you see how universal franchise gradually extends, right? First with the landed elite, then of course with men, then with women, then with African American, right? So slowly, slowly, slowly. The same you see with Europe. India was very different. It was an incredible leap of faith. And it worked. And it worked because in the case, for instance, with the Tamil Brahmins, when that happened, they left Tamil Nadu. So what did they do? They joined the central government. So if you see in the 50s and 60s and 70s, India's federal government is chock-a-block full of Tamil Brahmins, right? So why fight, right? Because conflict is costly. If you can sort of retain your privileges fairly easily. Then this began to extend to the rest of India. And the US came to the rescue because it opened up. And that's when a lot of these guys, families and kids. So it's not, of course, that everyone leaves. India is just way too large for people to leave. But you have enough of an exit option that you don't have to really, worry. And that's also a reason why this group has become much more private sector, friendly. So the lower castes now occupy the state, and the upper castes are global, and particularly part of the private sector. And that's, stabilized the system. There's conflict. Okay, so I'll sort of end up now. So what we see is, when we look at migration from India, is that over time, what has changed is, and this is not unique to India. If you remember China prior to the reforms of 79-80, the Chinese attitude towards the diaspora was also very, very hostile, right? And then, of course, it's changed in a huge way. Same with India. I mean, my bottom line is that whether diasporas or migration it can be something that's positive or negative, but the bottom line is it fundamentally depends on the country of origin. If you want to, if you send people out as a result of ethnic, cleansing, don't be surprised if they finance and fund extremist groups. I mean, it should not be, surprising. If you're not open to people of talent because you are insecure for some reason or otherwise, then you will never be able to harness or leverage your diaspora, even if they have all of that, right? If you make it impossible for people to invest in your country because of poor economic policies, it does not matter how wealthy their diaspora is, then they're not fools, they're not going to spend money, right? So to that extent, I think we should really try and understand why people leave. They leave for a reason, and who leaves, why they go, and where they go will really make, will certainly fundamentally affect. And I think what has changed is that by and large, you see a greater incidence in the Indian case of people leaving for economic reasons, and for reasons to enhance and increase their human capital for higher education, right? And that's why, and because India itself has changed, has become much more comfortable about globalization. It used to be it was not at all at ease of engaging with the world. And as it has become more self-confident in sort of dealing with the world, that self-confidence is also transmitted in greater self-confidence in dealing with its diaspora, which is why it is probably playing a more positive role now than at least it used to 20 years ago. I'll end there.
We have time for questions. I think we'll be happy to take the questions.
I'll pass this microphone around. We have attributed the maturation and stability of the democracy in India to the elite factor. Do you think there are some other factors that have really contributed to this particular phenomenon? I'm thinking, I'm an agnostic. Do you think it's the Hindu ethos and the tolerability of the Hindu religion that may have also contributed to this particular stability?
Well, you see, one is it would be a fundamental mistake to attribute something as complex as democracy to one factor. I mean, my thing was more about this being a factor in why breakdown did not occur. I'm more skeptical of an ethos in Hinduism, because Hinduism has been in India for thousands of years, but India has not been. You could argue, and people's views would surely vary, but India has not been particularly democratic prior to the current constitutional system. Now, people argue it was democratic at the village level and so on, but the existence of India has been socially hierarchical, and hierarchies of any kind are not particularly democratic in form or substance.
My question is a little different, but to the tune of what he was saying. I think personally that India has been democratic, especially when we see our neighbors. We have dictatorship in Pakistan for a long time, and other, for example, there was monarchy, of course, in Nepal, and they had assassinations and so forth. But I think Gandhiji played a substantial role in that. By his, we got our independence, it took a long time, but it was through non-violent means. And the passage of power from England to India, England wouldn't give our power to us so easily. In fact, they kept on postponing it, Quit India movement, that movement. And Gandhiji was a person who took the peasants and he did the, non-cooperative movement and burnt Swadeshi, and also he trained the people of India into passing on the rights. For example, if the opposition wins, we always pass the government to the other one, and we don't have, I think, this sort of because maybe the natural, the way that Indians are, they're comparatively patient, like in 1000 when Muhammad Ghaznavi attacked India, and the priests were still praying that the gods will help. That was not a very good thing. But basically what I want to say is that we've been a patient kind of people, and then we've been non-violent in our freedom struggle, and that has really been a very good reason why the democratic system in India has worked, because we do not believe in fighting for power. We believe if somebody's elected in the opposition, we have to give the power to the other person. So it's not exactly, your point is very good, in fact, a good food for thought, but I think that the passage of power from one party to other, for the way that we got a freedom for 40 years, we struggled for it, and the way that things happen, the people were educated in that sort of a grassroots sort of a education to give power. That's what I think.
Well, I think you have a very valid point. I think there's no doubt, and there's a lot of work, that the nature of the India's freedom movement stands out in that it's a protracted movement, and B, it's non-violent, right? That explains why India became democratic. It does not explain why it did not break down. Later on, when that old elite had gone, right? The fact is, Gandhi was dead, and he was dead not in a non-violent way, and that spread, of course. So it's more. So my explanation is, so one must analytically separate why something happens, which is why India becomes democratic, which is the very explanation which you have given. But you must separate that from a very different thing, which I'm trying to say is why you didn't have a breakdown. So these are two very different things. What your explanation is about the first, what I'm trying to point out is about the second. Yes?
So I have two questions. The first one is that it really, as far as I've understood, is suggesting that the Brahmin community in, let's say, the United States, the Brahmin diaspora community, is funneling a huge amount of money back to India. And so what I'm curious about, and they're channeling it to other Brahmins there, their relatives there, why hasn't that caused instability? So that's to say that you've created now a huge amount of wealth in the West among Brahmins, and you send it back to India. Why hasn't that changed the power structure to problematize kind of the stability of democracy? And then the reverse of that is that why hasn't the tremendous hierarchy, I would call it a reverse hierarchy, in the affirmative action and the quota system, people vying for how backward caste they can be. Why hasn't that created some instability? So
well, yeah, so two things. One is, I don't think so there is any evidence that the Brahmins here channel huge amounts of money to Brahmins. There just isn't. Okay. Yes, of course, like money flows. Most of the money, for instance, in financial remittances flows from Indian like labor that works in the Middle East. And now, in particular, the growth in the US has come from those so-called H-1B visa holders who are not part of the old elite. These are from smaller towns who are now making it. And it's the broadening and the deepening of India's human capital. These are not from the Delhis and Bombays. They are from the smaller towns, middle towns, and so on, right? See, rich people never send back remittances because their families are also rich. They don't need that money. Remittances is about household transfers. Okay, if a rich person sends money back, she or he is doing it as an investment, not for family maintenance. So remittances is technically a much narrower thing of finance. It's for maintenance of your family, right? So your brother needs to go to school, your sister's wedding, your father wants to buy a car, those sorts of things, right? But if your family is already pretty wealthy back there, they don't need your money, right? So financial, the money which I'm talking about is of a different type, right? The sort of second part of we have looked at carefully. So there was a lot of work, a lot of insinuation, especially after India had, some of you might know, these horrific anti-Muslim riots in 2002. And in the wake of those riots, there was a number of NGOs, etc., had claimed that the money for the groups that were behind it was coming from abroad, especially from the UK and the US. And, we looked at it pretty carefully. So I think there are two reasons why that is a mistaken belief. One is, it's not expensive to cause a riot in India. Anyone who believes you need large amounts of money to cause a riot in India singularly misunderstands what India is about. It is particularly not expensive if you are the ruling party or the government to raise money in India from 500 sources for a riot than having to go outside and get money. I mean, you just don't need that, right? So you don't have that. What we did was we looked at different social groups within the United States from India and their anti-Muslim bias. And there's a fair amount of anti-Muslim bias. Make no mistake about it. But the groups that have strong anti-Muslim bias is not where the riots take place. So Punjab, people from Punjab in the United States have a strong anti-Muslim bias, at least based on the survey evidence. Okay, I can only tell you what my evidence is. I can't go beyond that. Same from Bengal, you'll be surprised. But there are no riots in Punjab and Bengal because the state governments there politically have no incentive because they have a lot, in Bengal, Muslim voters matter a huge deal. In Punjab, there are no Muslims, right? So clearly that points to the fact that it's like domestic factors that are primary. Overseas money, as I said, is not that it's completely irrelevant, but it's marginal rather than the driver, right? Where your point about affirmative action and so on, affirmative action is very large. But see, if you look at the labor force that's entering, or the people entering the sort of labor force, only 1% of them can ever get a government job. So for 99% of them, in reality, affirmative action is irrelevant. So yes, for that 1% of jobs, there's massive affirmative action. But if the vast majority, it's irrelevant in any case, why are you going to fight over something which is not very relevant for you?
This is the It's on? This is to follow up on these questions about democracy. Excuse me. One election or even 5 elections do not a democracy make. This is not to gainsay the reality of democracy in India, but to probe it a little further. Is there anything in Indian history or in the Indian social makeup that contributes to democracy at the local level, in the small scale, and so forth? What I'm thinking about is democracy in the United States. By the time the revolution came, there were institutions all over the place where people were governing themselves at the local level. And so they had a lot of experience at it. Ironically enough, because of apartheid in South Africa, Africans had a good deal of experience at their local level, through churches and sports societies and singing clubs and things like that. The reason I'm coming to this question is I'm thinking about what's going to happen in Egypt, for example. In one respect, Egypt is like you said, they have that safety valve of people going out, not necessarily the upper classes, but people going out. Is there anything that you can tell us about Indian culture and society that says, yes, they did have a lot of intimate experience with running their own affairs in some things?
Well, you see, it links like to the point raised earlier about, so one of the things that has a central feature, or take a sort of cliche which, Rod McFarker, who Charlotte knows, at Harvard once quipped, China, you think of all state, no society. India is all society, no state. Right? So centralized, we think of China historically as having a very centralized state. It's always been there. India has never had that. So political hierarchies, in a centralized sense, have always been very weak, sort of in India. So the idea of of India being sort of village republics, 600,000 odd villages, each somewhat self-governed on its own. Within the village, you might have all these social hierarchies, but by and large, it's self-governed in that sense. And that's historically you had the panchayat system of local self-government and so on and so forth. So, in fact, that's been argued that's one reason why India could absorb so many invasions over the last, millennia, right? Because all the invaders would come and basically occupy Delhi and a few places. But that was it. The rest of India was, went on its own. It didn't have much of an effect. And you could argue the nature of Hindu-like religion, there's no centralized church, right? So there's no hierarchy there either. So you have very few really, in Indian society, strong centralized institutions sort of historically. It's just not been the case, right? Which is why, of course, creating centralized institutions of power has been more difficult after independence, because that has just not been the historical legacy and experience of India. Now, I think it's a question that is much debated whether that is a more fertile ground for formal democratic institutions, the way we think now of parliamentary democracy, right? That because you didn't have essentially competing structures, right? There weren't any competing structures in a sense. I think it's a question that's definitely been much debated. I think, however, that notwithstanding that important feature of Indian society, the struggle for power in lots of situations has led to very morbid outcomes. And there's no reason, Indian democracy, if anyone does follow it, is an incredibly rambunctious, very venal institution. I mean, we should have no doubts about it. But it's also the case that the rules of the game. I mean, we just 2 weeks ago, we organized a large conference comparing elections in the United States, India, and Canada. And we had all these academics, and we also had the chief election commissioners of US, of India, Canada, and the counterpart. There's no equivalent institution here, like from the US. And it was amazing, you know, when the Indian election commissioner sort of began his talk, you know, he took out a world map and said, okay, when I did, you know, conducted the last general elections in India, he took out a map. He took all the voters of Latin America, all the voters of North America, all the voters of Europe combined was less than the number of voters in India when he conducted the elections, right? The degree of his powers, the election commissioners from the US and Canada could only marvel at just how much power he has. You know, it is constitutionally, you know, written in. Now, writing those things in the Constitution, India was the first country whose constitution had the election commission written into the constitution, right? Which gives the election commission, once elections are announced, powers that he or she runs the entire government bureaucracies under their command once elections are announced. They have 400 to 500 permanent employees. During elections, they have 11 million, right? No government policy decision can be taken without the express concurrence of the election commission. Express. No giveaways, no gifts, nothing can be announced, which could have the slightest. But that was built into the constitution. There was no history in Indian society that would say that this ought to be. And I think everyone now sort of acknowledges that it's been a critical factor in keeping the elections free and fair, right? I mean, the fact is, even in the US, with all its incredibly strong institutions, you could have it's a 2000 type real conundrum. And the fact is, in India, as was said earlier, notwithstanding all the incredibly contentious politics, people lose, they leave. There's never been a challenged, individual elections might be challenged, but not as the overall, result. But as I said, I think I see the roots of that in the way the Constitution was designed. I don't see the roots of that in the nature of Indian, social norms per se. Constitutions were created by men who I think, just as the US, when you go back to the Constitution, it was an incredible group of people who created this incredibly far-reaching document. And I've been really, I have to say, really sort of amazed at the extraordinary quality of debates in the Indian Constituent Assembly debates. It's a really amazing people who were not at all representative, you could argue, of India. They're basically pretty highly educated upper caste men who created an incredibly egalitarian and far-reaching document. Was that within the particular historical moment, the nature of the Congress party at the time and so on, Gandhi, particular individuals and leaders, or was it far more deeper rooted in Indian? I'm not sure if I can cleanly separate out these.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'm just wondering about how well your argument does in other places around the world. So I'm trying to think of comparable cases, and it's really hard. South Africa, where there's an exodus of business elites. I'm not really sure. Have you thought about this and how well it might carry elsewhere?
Well, so one, I think good comparative thing which one did was, of course, is across the border with Pakistan, because it's a nice natural experiment. They started at the same time, from the same circumstances. Very clearly, the nature of Pakistani elite then and now is landed elite. Benazir Bhutto is loved in the United States because she went to Harvard, but otherwise her family is part of the big problems of Pakistan, right? Which is the massively landed elites, right? That was just not the case like with India, right? And that, of course, partly happened because the zamindari system was abolished when India became. So as I said, you had landed elites in a local sense, but not these giant, right? And now, so those guys have to do everything to hold on to the land, because that's not just the source of their economic base, but their political power at the national level, right? Same with when you look at, if you look at the history of early 20th century, sort of Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, and so on. Same when you look at Central America, right? Honduras and El Salvador and so on. Philippines. These were all places, the Philippines, because the US had been there. But you didn't see the US making the sort of land reforms in the Philippines, which it did in South Korea and Taiwan, right? Also Japan after the war. So I think one of the things for a number of contingent historical circumstances, the nature of India's initial elite, or the time was their capital was much more in mobile, in a sort of relative sense, in mobile human capital, rather than in mobile land. And of course, you can migrate much more if you have mobile capital than if you have immobile capital.